Hey there, and welcome to today's Explainer. I'm so incredibly thrilled to have you joining us. If you're the kind of person who loves to figure out how the big, complex pieces of our world fit together, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're about to jump into a seriously fascinating journey looking at how societies actually organize themselves. We're going to trace the path from the idea of absolute rulers right down to the rules and unpack the invisible framework that literally shapes our everyday lives. Yep, we're talking about government.
Here is our quick roadmap for the explainer today. We'll start with what is government, walk through a handy school analogy, break down the branches of power, explore the principles of democracy, look at other forms of government, and finally discuss exactly why your government matters.
All right, let's get right into section 1. What is government? Think of it as the hidden engine of our daily lives. So, I want to toss this fundamental question right out to you to start things off. What exactly is a government? Honestly, it's a word we hear constantly, right? On the news, from our friends, arguing in the comment section. But what is it at its very core? Well, just think about the stuff we use every single day. The paved roads you drive on, the postal worker dropping off your mail, the armed forces keeping the country safe, the traffic police keeping order on your morning commute, and the public hospitals and schools we all rely on. These everyday services, things we honestly take for granted all the time, are entirely coordinated and provided by this massive, overarching organizational structure that we call the government. The role of a government is just incredibly vast. It's a huge job. Its core functions include maintaining law and order so our communities don't dissolve into chaos, ensuring national security, and handling tricky relationships with other countries. Plus, they deliver essential services like we just mentioned with education and healthcare, and they manage the entire economy to try and keep things stable for the public. Basically, without this structure in place, a functioning society just wouldn't be possible.
Moving on to Section 2, the school representation analogy. Let's look at governance on a much smaller scale. To really wrap our heads around how this operates, let's shift gears and picture a micro-level scenario. Imagine a super bustling, chaotic school. It's packed with activities and things desperately need some organization. You've got complex timetables to make, massive sports events to run, daily lunches to serve to hundreds of kids, and morning assemblies to plan. The head teacher quickly realizes that to get all this done, they need to set up a student committee to make the rules, actually implement them, and make sure everyone's playing along.
So the head teacher has 3 main ways to form this committee. Option 1, make every single student responsible for every decision. I mean, you can guess how chaotic that would be. It'd be a total nightmare. Option 2, the head teacher simply handpicks the committee members herself, but that completely leaves the general student body out of the process. Then there's option 3, the students actually vote for their representatives, and the winners form the committee. Choosing representatives is by far the most effective way to handle a giant group while ensuring everyone's voice still matters. And guess what? That forms the very foundation of democratic representation.
Which brings us to Section 3, the branches of power and why the separation of duties is absolutely crucial.
Let's scale our little school analogy back up to the national level to see how this builds a real government structure. Just like the school committee needed to make rules, put them into action, and enforce them, a national government takes its massive, terrifying amount of power and divides it into 3 distinct buckets. You have the legislative branch, which actually creates the rules or laws. Then the executive branch implements those rules and runs the day-to-day administration. And finally, the judicial branch steps in to ensure those rules are being applied and followed fairly. This separation of duties is a huge deal because it guarantees no single group can ever hoard all the power. All right, Section 4, the principles of democracy, also known as power to the people.
So we know how the power is divided, but in a democracy, where does that power actually originate? Well, the answer lies in a super famous quote from U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. He described democracy as a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's punchy, it's memorable, and it just perfectly nails the core philosophy of democratic rule. The fundamental source of authority here isn't a king, it isn't a general with an army, it's the citizens themselves, us. But for a true democracy to actually function in the real world, you absolutely need a few foundational pillars. First step is equality, meaning everyone has equal access to things like education and healthcare, and everyone is treated exactly the same before the law. Next is freedom, so citizens can make their own choices and speak their minds without fear. You also need representative participation, which is the right to elect your leaders. And crucially, you need accountability.
The government literally has to answer to the people who put them in power in the first place.
And parliament buildings are exactly where those elected representatives go to do the heavy lifting. For instance, if you step inside the Indian parliament, which is a massive seat of legislative power, you're looking at the vast space where representatives gather from all over to debate, draft, and eventually pass the laws that will govern the entire nation.
Now let's pivot to Section 5, other forms of government. Who else holds the power? Because as popular as democracy is, it's definitely not the only way societies run things. Take monarchies, for example, which are ruled by kings or queens where power is handed down through the family. There's a really big difference between the two name types here. In an absolute monarchy, the monarch has total, unchecked control over making the laws and running the country. What they say goes. But in a constitutional monarchy, that monarch's power is actually limited and checked by a constitution, and they usually have to work alongside an elected legislature. Then you have a totally different system that impacts daily life in a huge way, a dictatorship. This is where one single person, or a really small group, holds absolute power without having to answer to any constitution. Our source material highlights a pretty wild story about a young guy named Shane living in North Korea to illustrate this. His government doesn't just pass boring laws about taxes, they dictate his mandatory military service. They completely block his access to the global internet, and get this, they even have strict rules about the clothes he can wear and the specific haircuts he's allowed to get. That is the very real, very intense reality of absolute government control.
Another form you might hear about is an oligarchy, which literally translates to rule by a few. There's this fantastic late 19th century political cartoon called The Bosses of the Senate that visualizes this perfectly. It depicts elected representatives sitting at their little desks, but looming over them are these massive wealthy monopolists, like the Sugar Trust and the Iron Trust. It perfectly captures a system where a small, ultra-wealthy and powerful group is making the real decisions, totally controlling the legislative process from the shadows.
And finally, Section 6, why your government matters, and the real impact it has on your daily life. Everything we've been talking about today really boils down to this critical point. The structure of your government directly dictates your everyday rights. Just look at freedom of speech. In a democracy, it's a fundamental right. In a monarchy, it might exist, sure, but it can certainly be restricted. And in a dictatorship, it is highly restricted or just completely gone, exactly like we saw with Shane's story. The actual well-being, happiness, and prosperity of a citizen is intimately tied to whether their government is accountable to the people or if it's only accountable to itself. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative question from our text to chew on. What are the possible hurdles in a democracy? Because let's be real, even the best systems face massive challenges. Things like corruption, the spread of misinformation, or unequal access to voting. The true power of a democracy relies entirely on everyday citizens actively participating. So what can you do as an individual to stay engaged, minimize those hurdles, and keep your democracy going strong? I want you to think about that as you go about the rest of your day. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep learning, and as always, keep asking great questions.